The morning sun rose over New Haven like it had done for the past 70 years since humans first settled this world. Captain Daniel Wright stood on the observation deck of the Orbital Defense Station and watched the golden light spread across the colony below. 12 million people lived down there on that beautiful green and blue planet. They had farms and cities and schools where children learned about Earth and dreamed of the stars. Daniel had been born on Earth, but he considered New Haven his home now after 20 years of service protecting this world. His coffee was still hot when the alarm started screaming. The sensor array had picked up something massive dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Daniel rushed to the command center where his crew was already pulling up tactical displays. 300 warships had just appeared, and they were not human vessels. The ship designs matched the Zarthan Confederation, and that made Daniel's blood run cold because the Zarthan were known across the galaxy as aggressive and territorial. Down on the planet's surface, Governor Lisa Brennan was having breakfast with her grandchildren when her emergency communicator started buzzing. She kissed the kids and told them to finish their food while she stepped into her office. The message from Captain Wright was brief and terrifying. A Zarthan fleet had arrived and they were moving toward New Haven. Lisa felt her hands shaking as she immediately sent out evacuation warnings to all cities and contacted Earth for help. The Zarthan, Admiral Vex, appeared on every screen across the colony within minutes. His face was reptilian with cold yellow eyes that showed no emotion. He spoke in Galactic Common, and his words were translated instantly. Humans had 6 hours to evacuate New Haven and abandon all colonies beyond the Sol system, or the Zarthan would destroy everything. He said humans had expanded too far into space and were taking worlds that belonged to older species. The Zarthan Confederation was here to push humanity back to Earth, where they belonged. Governor Brennan stood in the planetary command center surrounded by her staff and made a decision that would echo through history. She refused to surrender. This was her home and the home of 12 million people who had spent their lives building something beautiful on this world. She sent a response to Admiral Vex telling him that New Haven would not be abandoned and that Earth would send help. She knew that help was at least 3 weeks away, but she hoped the Zarthan would back down when they realized humans would fight. Commodore Peter Hayes commanded the Colonial Defense Fleet, and he knew his 40 ships stood no chance against 300 Zarthan warships. But he also knew that every minute he could buy would let more civilians evacuate. He ordered his fleet to form a defensive line between the approaching enemy and the planet. His crew were colonists who had trained for defense, but never expected to face a real battle. They were farmers and teachers and engineers who wore military uniforms part-time. Now they were going to war. The evacuation began immediately across every city on New Haven. Spaceports became chaos as millions of people tried to board shuttles that could only hold thousands. Parents pushed their children toward the ships while staying behind themselves. Teachers led whole classrooms of students to the launch pads. Medical staff helped elderly citizens and hospital patients toward the evacuation craft. Everyone knew there would not be enough time to save everyone. Commodore Hayes watched the Zarthan fleet approaching on his tactical screen and felt a cold certainty settle over him. His ships were older models that colonists used for system defense and patrol. The Zarthan had battlecruisers and destroyers that outgunned his entire fleet combined. But Peter had a wife and 2 sons down on New Haven, and if buying them time meant dying in space, then that was a price he would pay gladly. He opened a channel to all his ships and told them to hold the line as long as possible. The battle began exactly 4 hours after the Zarthan arrived. Admiral Vex had given humanity 6 hours, but he decided to attack early because he was bored of waiting. The Zarthan warships opened fire with plasma torpedoes that crossed the distance in seconds. Peter's fleet returned fire with everything they had, but their weapons barely scratched the enemy shields. Colonial ships started exploding in bright flashes of light and fire. Crews died instantly as hulls were torn open to the vacuum of space. Captain Daniel Wright launched every fighter and missile his station had while coordinating with the Colonial fleet. His crew worked frantically at their stations, trying to give targeting data and tactical support to the ships fighting below. But it was like watching a massacre in slow motion. The Zarthan were not just defeating the Colonial fleet, but they were destroying it with contempt. Every human ship that died was met with mocking transmissions from Zarthan captains who laughed at how weak humanity was. Commodore Hayes lost 30 of his 40 ships in the first 10 minutes. His own vessel was burning and losing atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches. He could see the planet New Haven on his view screen, and he could see the evacuation shuttles still launching from the surface. Not enough time. There would never be enough time. Peter made his final decision and ordered his remaining ships to ram the Zarthan vessels. If they were going to die anyway, then they would take as many enemies with them as possible. The colonists watched from the ground as their defenders made suicide runs into the alien fleet. Commodore Hayes aimed his flagship directly at a Zarthan battlecruiser and pushed his engines to maximum. The collision was visible from the surface as a bright new star that flared and died in seconds. Peter died, but he took 600 Zarthan crew with him. His sacrifice bought 15 more minutes for the evacuation. Captain Wright knew his station would be next. The Zarthan fleet was moving past the debris of the colonial defenders and approaching orbital space. He ordered all non-essential crew to evacuate, but most of them refused to leave their posts. They would fight until the end. Daniel started recording everything on every sensor and camera, because if humanity was going to lose New Haven, then Earth needed to see exactly what happened here. The recording would be transmitted continuously until the station was destroyed. Only 40,000 civilians made it off New Haven before the Zarthan bombardment began. 40,000 out of 12 million. Governor Brennan refused to evacuate and stayed in the command center coordinating rescue efforts until the very end. She was still sending orders when the first plasma torpedo hit the capital city and turned everything within 50 miles into molten glass. The Zarthan fleet fired without mercy on a defenseless world. Cities that had taken decades to build vanished in seconds. Forests planted by colonists burned in waves of fire that could be seen from orbit. The oceans began to boil as the bombardment continued. Schools and hospitals and homes were vaporized. 12 million people died screaming, or they died instantly depending on how close they were to the strikes. The planet that had been green and beautiful became black and red with fire and ash. Captain Wright watched it happen from his station and kept recording. Tears ran down his face as he watched his home die. His station shook as Zarthan ships targeted it with their weapons. He kept transmitting the footage until the final seconds. His last message was broadcast across human space on all frequencies. They did not just attack us, they enjoyed it, make them pay. Then his station exploded and Daniel died with his crew still at their posts. The evacuation ships that escaped carried 40,000 traumatized survivors who had watched their entire world burn. They carried the footage that Captain Wright had died to transmit. They carried the names of 12 million dead, and they carried something else that would prove more dangerous to the Zarthan than any weapon. They carried the rage of humanity awakened. The footage from New Haven reached Earth 3 weeks after the attack and the planet stopped. Every screen in every home and every public space showed the same horrifying images. People watched cities burn and children die and an entire world turn to ash. The recordings that Captain Daniel Wright died to transmit were played again and again. 12 million people had been alive and then they were gone, murdered. The word spread across Earth like wildfire, and with it came a rage that humanity had not felt in generations. President Karen Mitchell sat in the emergency council chamber, surrounded by military commanders and government officials. She had watched the footage 12 times, trying to comprehend the scale of what happened. Her hands were shaking as she called the session to order. The room was silent except for the sound of breathing and the hum of equipment. Everyone present knew that what they decided in the next few hours would change human history forever. Admiral Jack Sullivan was the commander of Earth's home fleet, and he stood before the council with a proposal that seemed impossible. He said they needed to convert every shipyard in the Sol system to warship production. Every factory would be retooled for military equipment. Every resource would be directed toward building the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled. He said they would not negotiate with the Zarthan and they would not show mercy. They would build an armada so massive that the galaxy would never forget what happens when you attack humanity. The council chamber erupted in voices as people argued and shouted. Some said the cost would banker upped Earth and all her colonies. Others said it would take decades to build such a fleet. A few voices called for diplomacy and trying to negotiate with the Zarthan. But then the screen showed New Haven burning again and the voices calling for peace grew quiet. President Mitchell raised her hand and the room fell silent. She spoke in a voice that was steady despite her anger. The Zarthan had not attacked a military target or a strategic installation. They had murdered 12 million civilians, including children and elderly and people who had never held a weapon. They had burned a peaceful colony. that was home to families who only wanted to live and grow and be left alone. The Zarthan had done this to send a message that humanity should stay confined to Earth. President Mitchell said that humanity would send a message back and that message would be written in fire and steel. The vote was unanimous. Every member of the council agreed to total war. Within hours, the orders went out across Earth and to every human colony. The economy shifted overnight. Car factories started producing tanks. Civilian shipyards began constructing warships. Research facilities focused all efforts on military technology. Universities graduated engineers early and sent them to defense projects. The entire species mobilized for war. Admiral Helen Carter was appointed Supreme Commander of Naval Operations, and she set up her headquarters in the military complex near Geneva. She had spent 40 years in the Navy and had fought in small conflicts with pirates and raiders, but nothing had prepared her for this. She was being asked to coordinate the construction and deployment of hundreds of thousands of warships. The logistics alone seemed impossible. But Helen looked at the footage from New Haven and knew she would find a way. General Frank Morris took command of all ground forces and began expanding the Marine Corps by a factor of 50. Recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. Young people who had been students or workers or artists lined up to enlist. They wanted to fight. They wanted revenge. Frank had to turn away thousands because the training facilities could not handle the numbers. He ordered new boot camps built on every continent and on the Moon and on Mars. Chief Engineer Paul Davidson was given control of industrial expansion, and he attacked the problem like a man possessed. He worked 20-hour days coordinating with factory managers and shipyard directors in mining operations. Raw materials needed to flow in constant streams from asteroid belts and lunar mines. Assembly lines needed to operate perfectly without breaks or delays. Paul created schedules and systems that pushed every facility to maximum output and then pushed them harder. The message sent to the Zarthan Confederation was brief and cold. It said that humanity held them responsible for genocide and that war was inevitable. There would be no negotiations and no peace until justice was delivered. The Zarthan response was dismissive. They said humans were a young species that did not understand galactic politics. They said New Haven was destroyed to teach humanity their place. They said if Earth wanted war, then the Zarthan would destroy the human homeworld just as easily. That response was a mistake. The Zarthan had given humanity something to unite behind. Every political faction and every nation on Earth put aside their differences. Resources were shared freely. Technology was given without patents or restrictions. The goal was simple and everyone agreed on it. Build a fleet large enough to crush the Zarthan completely and make sure no other species ever thought about attacking humanity again. Senator Claire Bennett gave a speech in the Global Senate that was broadcast to every human settlement in space. She stood at the podium with the footage from New Haven playing on screens behind her. She talked about the children who died holding their parents' hands. She talked about the teachers who stayed with their students until the end. She talked about Governor Lisa Brennan who refused to abandon her people. Then she talked about what humanity would do in response. Claire said that the cost of war would be enormous. People would die in the fighting. The economy would suffer. Life would be harder for everyone. But the cost of doing nothing would be worse. If humanity did not respond with overwhelming force, then every species in the galaxy would see them as weak. Other colonies would be attacked. Earth itself might be targeted. The only way to guarantee safety was to show the galaxy that humanity could not be pushed around or intimidated or killed without consequences. That would be absolutely devastating. The speech was met with standing ovations that lasted for minutes. People in the streets held vigils for New Haven. Memorial services were held in every city on Earth. The names of the 12 million dead were read aloud in ceremonies that took days to complete. Each name was a reminder of why the war was necessary. Each name was fuel for the anger that was building across human space. On Mars, the industrial expansion began immediately. Orbital shipyards that had built 3 vessels at a time were enlarged to handle 20. New construction facilities were built in weeks instead of years. Workers volunteered for triple shifts. Accidents happened and people died from exhaustion or equipment failures, but the work continued. Everyone understood that speed was essential. The longer it took to build the fleet, the more time the Zarthan had to prepare or attack other colonies. The Moon became a massive mining operation that stripped resources from the surface and sent them to processing facilities. Automated systems worked around the clock extracting metals and rare elements. The asteroid belt was swarmed with mining ships that brought back loads of ore every day. Jupiter's moons were tapped for water and fuel. Every resource in the Sol system was mobilized for war production. Dr. Laura Stevens led the weapons development program, and her team worked miracles. They designed railguns that could fire projectiles at a percentage of light speed. They created missiles with fusion warheads that could crack capital ships in half. They developed shield systems that could absorb punishment from multiple enemies. Every weapon was tested and retested until it performed perfectly. Failure was not acceptable because human lives would depend on these systems. Training academies opened on Earth and Mars and a dozen colony worlds. Commander Ryan Foster ran the largest academy on Phobos, where new officers learned everything they needed to know in 6 months of brutal instruction. The courses were compressed and intense. Students spent 16 hours a day in classes and simulations. They learned tactics and engineering and ship command. Those who could not handle the pressure washed out, but most pushed through because they wanted to fight. Civilian support for the war effort was total. Families grew victory gardens to reduce strain on food production. Children collected scrap metal for recycling. Elderly citizens worked in factories and communication centers. Everyone contributed something. The unity was remarkable, and it came from shared grief and shared anger. New Haven had been everyone's colony, and the 12 million dead belonged to all humanity. President Mitchell addressed the planet 6 months into the mobilization. She said that construction was ahead of schedule and that the fleet would be larger than anyone imagined. She said that humanity would not stop until the Zarthan paid for what they had done. She promised that New Haven would be avenged, and that the galaxy would learn to respect humanity. The speech was met with grim determination rather than cheers, because everyone knew the war would be bloody and terrible. Admiral Sullivan reviewed the construction reports and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The fleet was growing faster than projected. The ships were well designed and heavily armed. The crews were training hard and learning quickly. In less than 2 years, humanity would have an armada that could challenge any power in the galaxy. The Zarthan had awoken something they did not understand. They had attacked a species that was patient and creative, and absolutely ruthless when provoked. Soon they would face the consequences. Mars had always been humanity's second home, but now it became something else entirely. The red planet transformed into a forge where the tools of vengeance were being shaped. Director Andrew Cole stood in the control center of the Olympus Mons shipyards and watched construction on 50 dreadnoughts happening simultaneously. The orbital facilities had expanded so much that they formed a ring around Mars visible from the surface. Millions of workers lived in habitat modules attached to the shipyards, and they rarely saw the planet below because their entire existence revolved around building warships. The dreadnoughts took shape in the black void like metal monsters being born. Each one was 800 meters long and bristled with weapons. The hulls were thick armor plating that could withstand direct hits from plasma torpedoes. The engines were powerful enough to push the massive vessels to speeds that seemed impossible for something so large. Inside each ship were quarters for 3,000 crew members who would live and fight together. Andrew watched them come together piece by piece and felt pride mixed with grim purpose. These ships existed for one reason only, and that was to destroy the Zarthan. Commander Ryan Foster ran the Phobos Fleet Academy, where officers were trained in compressed courses that pushed human limits. The program that once took 4 years now took 6 months. Students started their day at 5 in the morning and finished at midnight. They studied navigation and weapons systems and tactical command. They practiced in simulators that recreated every possible combat scenario. The neural link technology allowed them to experience battles that felt completely real. Students died in the simulations over and over until they learned to survive and win. Ryan walked through the training facilities and saw exhaustion on every face. Young men and women who had been civilians a year ago were now becoming warriors. They learned to make life and death decisions in seconds. They learned to stay calm when their ships were burning around them. They learned that hesitation could cost lives and that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. Some students broke under the pressure and were reassigned to other duties, but most adapted because they carried the memory of New Haven with them always. Dr. Laura Stevens worked in the Valles Marineris Research Complex, where weapons were designed and tested. Her team had created the Mark 7 railgun that could punch through 3 meters of composite armor. The weapon used magnetic acceleration to fire projectile rounds at incredible speeds. When a railgun round hit an enemy ship, it did not just damage the vessel, but it often went completely through and came out the other side. Laura watched the test firings and smiled grimly. The Zarthan had plasma torpedoes, but humanity had physics on their side. The Prometheus missile was another breakthrough that came from Laura's team. It carried a fusion warhead that released the power of a small star when it detonated. A single missile could cripple a battleship, and 3 could destroy it completely. The missiles were smart and could evade point defense systems by using unpredictable flight patterns. They could also coordinate with each other to overwhelm enemy shields. Laura knew that when these weapons were used in combat, the results would be devastating. Production quotas that seemed impossible were being met every single day. The shipyards were supposed to complete 1 dreadnought per day, but they were averaging 5. Then the average went to 10. Then it climbed to 20. The workers pushed themselves beyond normal human limits. They took stimulants to stay awake longer. They worked through injuries. They skipped meals and sleep. Accidents happened regularly and people died, but the deaths only made everyone else work harder. Every worker knew someone who had died on New Haven, and that knowledge kept them going. Captain Eric Walsh commanded the first operational battle group to leave the shipyards. His fleet of 50 dreadnoughts conducted exercises in the asteroid belt, where they tested every system repeatedly. The ships practiced formations and maneuvers until the crews could execute them perfectly. They fired their weapons at designated asteroids and watched the massive rocks shatter into dust. Eric pushed his people hard because he knew that mistakes in training meant deaths in combat. His crews learned to work as one unified force that could respond to threats instantly. Down in the underground cities of Mars, the civilian population supported the war effort in countless ways. Children worked in factories during their free time assembling small components for ship systems. They sorted parts and ran quality control checks. The work was tedious but important because every component needed to function perfectly. Elderly citizens who could not serve in combat worked in communication centers coordinating logistics across the system. They tracked shipments of raw materials and finished products. They solved problems before they became critical issues. Vice Admiral Greg Palmer managed the logistics network that kept everything functioning. Raw materials flowed from asteroid mines in constant streams. The ore was refined in processing stations and turned into pure metals. Fabrication plants shaped the metals into hull plates and structural beams. Component manufacturers built the thousands of parts that went into each ship. Assembly stations brought everything together into finished warships. The supply chain was enormously complex, and Greg coordinated it all with quiet efficiency. The factories on Mars operated without pause. Assembly lines ran 24 hours every day without breaks. Robots handled the heavy work while humans supervised and made adjustments. Quality control was strict because flawed components could fail in battle and cost lives. Every part was inspected multiple times before being approved. The reject rate was kept below 1% through constant vigilance. Workers took pride in their craftsmanship because they knew their work would protect human lives. Food production on Mars increased dramatically to feed the millions of workers. Underground farms grew crops in hydroponic systems. Protein was manufactured in vats using engineered bacteria. The food was not fancy, but it was nutritious and filling. Workers ate at their stations or in communal cafeterias during brief breaks. Meals were functional rather than enjoyable, but nobody complained. Comfort was secondary to the mission. Living conditions in the habitat modules were cramped and basic. Workers slept in small rooms with minimal furniture. There was no privacy and no luxury. Showers were brief and rationed. Entertainment was limited to propaganda broadcasts that reminded everyone why they were fighting. The broadcasts showed footage from New Haven repeatedly. They showed the cities burning and the people dying. They showed what the Zarthan had done. The message was clear and it was reinforced constantly. This is why we work. This is why we sacrifice. This is why we will not stop until they pay. Dr. Laura Stevens lost 3 members of her research team in an explosion when a prototype weapon malfunctioned. The blast killed them instantly and injured a dozen others. Laura attended the memorial service and spoke about their sacrifice. Then she went back to work because stopping was not an option. The weapon was redesigned with better safety features and testing continued. The team that died was replaced within days and the project moved forward. Commander Ryan Foster graduated his 50th class of officers and watched them board transports that would take them to their ships. He had trained 10,000 officers in the past year. Some of them would die in the coming war, and that thought kept him awake at night. But Ryan knew that his training gave them the best possible chance to survive and win. He made the courses harder with each graduating class because he wanted his students to be ready for anything. Captain Eric Walsh received orders to begin combat drills with live ammunition. His battle group engaged in mock battles with other groups where they tried to destroy each other without actually firing fatal shots. The exercises revealed weaknesses in tactics and communication. Commanders learned to anticipate enemy movements and coordinate their attacks. The battle groups that performed poorly were retrained until they met standards. Excellence was the minimum acceptable level of performance. Director Andrew Cole reviewed construction numbers and felt satisfaction at the progress. The shipyards were producing dreadnoughts faster than anyone had predicted. Supplies were flowing smoothly. Worker morale remained high despite the brutal conditions. The fleet was growing every day, and it was growing into something magnificent and terrible. Andrew knew that when this armada was complete, it would be the most powerful military force in galactic history. The Zarthan had no idea what was coming for them. Mars had become a world dedicated entirely to war. Every resource and every person served the same goal. The planet glowed at night from the light of factories and shipyards. The sky was filled with construction traffic moving materials and finished ships. The population had doubled in 1 year as workers arrived from Earth and other colonies. They came to be part of something historic. They came to help build the weapon that would avenge New Haven. The work was exhausting and dangerous and sometimes fatal, but nobody quit. People collapsed from exhaustion and were given stimulants and sent back to work. Injuries were treated quickly so workers could return to their stations. Mental breakdowns happened but were handled with counseling and medication. The mission was too important to let individual suffering slow it down. Everyone understood that their discomfort was nothing compared to what the people of New Haven had endured. Admiral Helen Carter visited Mars to inspect the progress and was stunned by what she saw. The shipyards stretched across orbital space in every direction. Ships were being assembled faster than she could count them. The workers moved with purpose and determination. Helen realized that humanity had tapped into something primal and powerful. The species had been hurt badly, and now it was responding with focused rage. She sent a report back to Earth saying that the fleet would be ready ahead of schedule, and when it deployed, the galaxy would tremble. 22 months after New Haven burned, the fleet was ready. 500,000 dreadnoughts gathered in formations that stretched across the inner solar system from Mercury to Mars. The ships formed groups of 500 vessels each, creating battle groups that could operate independently or combine into overwhelming force. No species in galactic history had ever assembled a fleet this large. The Zarthan had 300 ships when they attacked New Haven. Humanity was bringing 500,000 in response. Admiral Jack Sullivan stood on the bridge of the EAS Retribution and looked at the tactical display showing the entire armada. His flagship was a super dreadnought 3 kilometers long with weapons that could level continents. The ship had cost more than some colonies were worth, and it carried a crew of 20,000. Around him, the commander staff worked at their stations with quiet efficiency. These were professionals who had trained for this moment. They knew their jobs and they knew what was expected. There would be no mistakes and no mercy. The fleet was organized into 1,000 battle groups, and each group had a commander who reported directly to Sullivan. Admiral Helen Carter commanded the vanguard forces that would lead the attack. General Frank Morris commanded the Marine divisions that would board enemy vessels and space stations. Every commander had studied Zarthan tactics for months. They knew how the enemy fought, and they knew their weaknesses. This would not be a fair fight. It would be an execution. Chaplain George Murphy moved through the fleet holding services for those who wanted spiritual comfort. He spoke in chapels aboard the dreadnoughts to crews who faced the possibility of death. George talked about justice and protecting the innocent. He talked about the 12 million dead who deserved to be avenged. His words resonated because they matched what everyone felt deep inside. This was not a war of conquest or greed. This was righteous anger made manifest in steel and fire. Lieutenant Amy Rogers sat at her navigation station aboard the dreadnought Vengeance and ran through her pre-jump checks. She had lost her younger sister on New Haven. Katie had been 8 years old and wanted to be a teacher. She died in the first bombardment when plasma torpedoes turned her school into vapor. Amy had volunteered for the fleet the day after receiving the news. She had trained hard and earned her position. Now she would help deliver justice for Katie and millions like her. Engineer Chris Bennett worked deep in the reactor room of his ship, monitoring the fusion cores that powered the massive vessel. He was 47 years old and had no military experience before volunteering. His daughter Rachel had been a doctor on New Haven. She died trying to evacuate patients from a hospital that was hit directly. Chris had been a civilian engineer on Earth, but he left his comfortable life to serve. He learned quickly and became essential to his ship's operations. Age did not matter when rage provided motivation. The final briefing connected all ship commanders through quantum communication. Admiral Sullivan's face appeared on 500,000 view screens as he delivered his orders. He spoke calmly, but his words carried weight. The Zarthan had shown their nature at New Haven by killing without mercy or hesitation or remorse. Today humanity would show the galaxy what happened when you murdered 12 million innocents. The fleet was not going to the Zarthan home system for conquest or glory. They were going for justice, and that justice would be absolute. Sullivan explained the battle plan in detail. The Armada would jump into Zarthan space simultaneously, emerging in perfect formation. The Vanguard would engage the defense fleet while the main force moved to secure orbital space around their planets. Marines would capture key installations and government centers. The Zarthan leadership would be arrested and tried for war crimes. Anyone who resisted would be destroyed. The operation was planned down to the minute, and every commander knew their role exactly. Captain Eric Walsh commanded Battle Group 47, and he listened to the briefing while reviewing his own tactical plans. His 50 ships would be part of the first wave hitting the Zarthan defense fleet. Eric had drilled his crews relentlessly for this moment. They could execute complex maneuvers while under fire. They could coordinate attacks with other groups seamlessly. His people were ready and eager. They had all lost someone at New Haven, and they all wanted blood. The crew of the Retribution made final preparations as the jump time approached. Weapons officers armed missiles and charged railguns. Shield operators brought defensive systems to full power. Damage control teams positioned themselves throughout the ship, ready to respond to breaches or fires. Medical staff prepared operating rooms expecting casualties. Everyone had a job and everyone performed it perfectly. This was what they had trained for during 22 months of brutal preparation. Admiral Helen Carter addressed her Vanguard forces through a private channel. She told them they would be first into battle and first to engage the enemy. The Zarthan would have defense fleets protecting their home system, and those fleets would fight hard. Casualties were expected, but victory was certain. Helen reminded her commanders that they carried the rage of all humanity behind them. The 12 million dead demanded justice, and the Vanguard would deliver it. General Frank Morris spoke to his Marines, who were loaded into assault transports attached to the main fleet. These men and women would board enemy stations and ships after the naval battle. They would capture Zarthan leadership and secure strategic locations. Frank told them to be ruthless but professional. Prisoners who surrendered would be taken alive. Those who fought would be killed. The galaxy would see that humanity could be both merciful and merciless depending on circumstances. Lieutenant Amy Rogers checked her navigation systems one final time. The jump coordinates were locked into every ship's computer. 500,000 vessels would transition to hyperspace at exactly the same moment. They would emerge in Zarthan space in a formation designed to maximize tactical advantage. The coordination required was staggering, but humanity had mastered the technology and the planning. Amy felt nervous excitement building in her stomach. Soon they would face the enemy. Engineer Chris Bennett monitored his reactor readings and saw all systems operating within normal parameters. The fusion cores were stable and producing massive amounts of power. When the jump happened, those cores would be pushed to maximum output to charge weapons and shields. Chris had maintained these systems perfectly because he knew lives depended on his work. He thought about Rachel and hoped she would be proud of what he was doing. Across the fleet, similar scenes played out on every ship. Crews made final checks and said quiet prayers. Some people looked at pictures of loved ones who died at New Haven. Others wrote letters to family back home in case they did not survive. The mood was grim determination mixed with anticipation. Everyone wanted this fight. Everyone needed this fight. The Zarthan had hurt humanity badly, and now humanity would return that pain 1,000-fold. Admiral Sullivan stood on the bridge of the Retribution and felt the weight of command. He was about to lead 500,000 ships into battle. Hundreds of thousands of people would die in the next few days. Some of them would be human, but most would be Zarthan. Jack did not feel joy at the prospect of killing, but he felt certainty. This was necessary. The Zarthan had committed genocide and they needed to face consequences. If humanity did not respond with overwhelming force, then other species would think humans were weak and vulnerable. The countdown reached its final minute. All across the Armada, crews fell silent as they waited. Navigation officers had their hands on controls, ready to execute the jump. Weapons officers watched their targeting systems. Shield operators monitored defensive fields. Every person on every ship was focused on their duty. The silence was profound, like the calm before a storm. Sullivan gave the order that would echo through history. All ships jump on my mark. For New Haven, for humanity, for every soul we lost. Jump. Space tore open as 500,000 warships activated their hyperspace drive simultaneously. The distortion was visible from Earth as a ripple in the fabric of reality. The Armada vanished, leaving the Sol system empty, except for construction vessels and defense platforms. The fleet was gone, but they would return victorious or not at all. Those who remained behind waited anxiously for news. President Karen Mitchell stood in the command center on Earth, watching the displays that tracked the fleet's progress. Communication would be delayed, but eventually reports would come back. Karen felt the weight of her decision to go to war. She had committed humanity to a path that could not be reversed. But when she thought about New Haven and the 12 million dead, she knew it was the right choice. The families of crew members gathered in public spaces across Earth and Mars and every colony. They watched news broadcasts that showed the empty space where the Armada had been. They prayed and hoped and feared. Some would receive word that their loved ones died. Others would welcome home heroes. All of them understood that this moment would define humanity's place in the galaxy forever. The jump would take 6 hours. For 6 hours, the fleet traveled through hyperspace in a dimension where normal physics did not apply. For 6 hours, the crews waited in their ships knowing that battle was approaching. For 6 hours, humanity held its breath. Then the Armada emerged in Zarthan space and the war began. The Zarthan home system, called Zarthax Prime, contained 7 inhabited planets orbiting twin stars. 14 billion Zarthan lived here in cities that had stood for thousands of years. Their defense fleet of 8,000 warships patrolled the system, protecting what they considered the center of their civilization. They had defended this territory against all enemies for 3 millennia. Nothing had ever threatened the home system because the Zarthan were strong, and their enemies were weak. The human armada materialized in Zarthan space like a nightmare becoming real. 500,000 dreadnoughts appeared simultaneously in a formation that stretched across millions of kilometers. The sheer mass of the fleet created gravitational distortions that registered on every sensor in the system. Ships blocked out stars. Their hulls reflected the light of the twin suns, creating a second metal sky. The Zarthan defense fleet looked at their sensors and could not believe what they were seeing. Admiral Vex commanded the Zarthan forces from his flagship positioned near the largest planet. He had been the one who ordered New Haven destroyed. He had watched the human colony burn and felt satisfaction. Humans were a young, weak species that needed to learn their place. Now he stared at the tactical display showing more ships than he thought possible. His communications officer reported that human vessels outnumbered them 60-1. Vex felt fear for the first time in his military career. Admiral Jack Sullivan opened a broadcast channel that reached every Zarthan ship and station and planetary government. His face appeared on their screens and his voice was cold. 22 months ago, you murdered 12 million civilians. You burned a peaceful colony world. You believed we would submit. You were wrong. I am Admiral Jack Sullivan of the Earth Alliance Navy. We are here for judgment. The Zarthan government tried desperately to negotiate. They sent messages offering reparations and territory. They promised to recognize human sovereignty over all colonies. They offered formal apologies and peace treaties. Emperor Kresh himself appeared on communication channels begging for mercy. Sullivan's response was silence followed by a single word: fire. The human fleet opened fire with coordinated volleys that turned night into day across the Zarthan system. Railgun rounds crossed the distance at a fraction of light speed and punched through Zarthan shields like they did not exist. Missiles swarmed in clouds so thick they blotted out stars. Energy weapons carved through armor that had been considered invincible. The Zarthan defense fleet began dying immediately. Lieutenant Amy Rogers worked her navigation station as the Vengeance moved into attack position. Around her ship, the battle unfolded in terrible beauty. Explosions bloomed in the void. Zarthan vessels broke apart under sustained fire. Human dreadnoughts advanced in perfect formation, absorbing return fire on their heavy shields. Amy thought about her sister Katie and felt grim satisfaction. This was for her. This was for all of them. The Zarthan tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed. Their plasma torpedoes hit human shields and dissipated. Their formations broke apart under the relentless assault. Ships that tried to flee were hunted down and destroyed. Those that surrendered were ignored because Sullivan had given no orders to accept surrender yet. The killing continued without pause. Captain Eric Walsh led his battle group against a cluster of Zarthan battleships defending one of the inner planets. His 50 dreadnoughts coordinated their fire to strip shields, then pummel hulls. The Zarthan fought desperately but uselessly. Eric watched enemy ships explode and felt nothing. These were the people who had murdered colonists. They deserved no mercy, and they would receive none. Admiral Helen Carter commanded the vanguard forces that pushed deep into the system toward the capital planet. Her ships encountered heavy resistance from defense stations that had protected Zarthax Prime for centuries. The stations were massive fortifications bristling with weapons. They lasted less than an hour under focused assault from human dreadnoughts. Carter's forces dismantled them, systematically turning ancient defenses into expanding debris clouds. Engineer Chris Bennett kept the reactors running at maximum output as his ship took hits from Zarthan weapons. Damage reports came in constantly. Hull breaches. Fire on Deck 7. Casualties in Section 12. Chris rerouted power and kept the ship fighting. He thought about Rachel and knew she would understand why this had to happen. The Zarthan had made their choice at New Haven. Now they faced the consequences. Within 3 hours, the Zarthan defense fleet was effectively destroyed. 8,000 ships reduced to wreckage and corpses. The human armada had lost fewer than 200 vessels. The battle was not a contest. It was extermination. The surviving Zarthan ships broadcast surrender signals. Admiral Sullivan finally ordered his fleet to accept them. Boarding parties from General Frank Morris's Marine divisions secured the damaged vessels and took crews prisoner. Emperor Kresh made a final desperate plea from the Imperial Palace on the capital planet. He appeared on communication channels with his family around him. He begged Sullivan to spare the civilian population. He offered complete surrender and said the Zarthan would accept any terms. Sullivan responded with cold precision. "You had your chance to stop this 22 months ago. You chose genocide. Now you will understand what it costs." Human Marines launched from assault transports in the thousands. Dropships descended on government centers and military headquarters across the 7 planets. General Morris personally led the team that stormed the Imperial Palace. Zarthan guards tried to resist, but they were no match for human soldiers who had trained specifically for urban combat. The palace fell in 2 hours. Emperor Kresh was dragged from his throne room in restraints. His crown was left on the floor. His guards were killed or captured. Morris stood before the Zarthan leader and felt contempt. This was the creature who had authorized the attack on New Haven. He looked weak and pathetic now. Morris had him loaded onto a transport bound for the Retribution, where he would face trial. Admiral Vex was captured when his damaged flagship was boarded. He fought until the end and killed 3 Marines before being subdued. They found him in his command center, surrounded by dead crew members. His uniform was burned and his face was scarred. He looked at the human soldiers with hatred. They stunned him and dragged him away. The occupation of the Zarthan home system took 72 hours. Human forces established control over every strategic location. Defense grids were dismantled. Weapons facilities were seized. Government buildings were occupied. The Zarthan military ceased to exist as an organized force. Their empire was broken and their people were helpless. Admiral Sullivan convened a war crimes tribunal aboard the Retribution. Emperor Kresh and Admiral Vex were brought before human judges along with 400 other Zarthan officials who had participated in the attack on New Haven. The proceedings were broadcast across the entire galaxy. Every species watched as humanity delivered justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Tactical recordings showed the Zarthan discussing the attack. Communication logs proved the orders came from the highest levels. The footage from New Haven was played, showing cities burning and people dying. The Zarthan defendants had no defense. They had committed genocide and everyone knew it. The sentences were delivered without emotion. Emperor Kresh was found guilty of ordering the death of 12 million civilians. Admiral Vex was found guilty of executing that order. Both were sentenced to death by firing squad. Their executions were carried out within hours. The other defendants received prison terms ranging from decades to life. They would spend the rest of their lives remembering what their choices had cost. Admiral Sullivan addressed the galaxy from the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by the wreckage of the Zarthan fleet. Let this serve as a warning to every species among the stars. Humanity seeks peace. We desire cooperation and mutual prosperity. But if you bring war to our worlds, if you murder our people, if you believe we can be intimidated or destroyed, you will learn what we learned from our own history. We are capable of incredible kindness and terrible wrath. Choose wisely which one you wish to encounter. The human fleet remained in Zarthan space for 6 months, ensuring the occupation was complete. A provisional government was established under human oversight. The Zarthan would rebuild, but they would do so under terms that guaranteed they could never threaten anyone again. Reparations were paid to the survivors of New Haven, though no amount of money could replace the dead. President Karen Mitchell traveled to the ruins of New Haven to dedicate a memorial. The planet was still dead. The atmosphere was toxic. The cities were glass and ash. But humanity built a monument there anyway. 12 million names were carved into black stone. The inscription was simple. They were our family. They lived in peace and died in fire. We answered their deaths with justice. May the galaxy remember, and may it never happen again. When the Armada finally returned to Earth, there were no celebrations. The ships came home quietly and crews disembarked without fanfare. Too many had died on both sides. The war had been necessary, but it left scars that would take generations to heal. The fleet dispersed to stations across human space. The Dreadnoughts remained active as a reminder that humanity would defend itself with overwhelming force. Admiral Sullivan retired to a quiet life and rarely spoke about the war. When asked years later about his role, he said simply that he did what needed to be done. He hoped future generations would never face the same choice. But if they did, he prayed they would have the strength to see it through. The 500,000 Dreadnoughts patrolled human space for 2 centuries before being replaced by newer vessels. But their legacy endured. Humanity had been tested and had emerged as a power that shaped galactic politics. The name New Haven was never forgotten. The lesson it taught echoed through the ages. Humanity would go to any length and pay any price and unleash any horror to protect its own. The galaxy learned that lesson and remembered it well.